Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, ready to dive deep. Today we're tackling a topic that still gets people fired up. The Vietnam War. But we're not just, skimming the surface here.
Definitely not.
You've given us a ton of reading material.
A lot to unpack.
So we're going way beyond just dates and battles. We're trying to figure out, was Vietnam a huge failure for America's whole containment strategy? Or was there something more to it, strategically speaking?
It's such an interesting question because it's not just about one war, right? It's about understanding these massive forces that shaped, the entire second half of the 20th century.
Exactly. So before we even get to Vietnam itself, we need to back up a bit. What did containment even mean back then? Back in the 50s and 60s? It's easy to throw that word around, but...
It's almost like, imagine the U.S. drawing this line in the sand and saying to communism, nope, you can stay where you are, but don't even think about going any further. That's containment in a nutshell.
And that fear, a big part of that was this domino theory, right?
Yeah.
Like if one country falls to communism, then all the surrounding ones are going to topple over one by one.
Yeah. Exactly. And you see that reflected in things like Kennan's long telegram, the Truman Doctrine, the idea that communism had to be contained no matter what. And that leads us to Vietnam, which, well, on the surface, it looks like that domino theory playing out in a really tragic way.
Yeah, it's almost like watching a car crash in slow motion,
Yeah.
Like it's going to be bad, but you just can't look away. The fall of Saigon in 75, over 58,000 American soldiers dead, millions of Vietnamese dead, the financial cost, a staggering $140 billion.
The heavy stuff.
It's no wonder historians like Arthur Schlesinger Jr. saw it as this huge blow to America's image on the world stage.
He made a strong case, Schlesinger argued that the whole Vietnam War was based on this flawed understanding of what the communist threat actually was. And you can see his point. The cost of containment in this case was just astronomical.
And the impact back home in the U.S., too. I mean, talk about a society divided. Anti-war protests, this growing distrust in the government, the credibility gap, as they called it. Lyndon B. Johnson, he actually decided not to run for re-election because of all the pressure surrounding Vietnam. Can you imagine?
It left some deep scars on American society. This war really shook the public's trust in their government, led to this, national soul-searching that's honestly still going on today in some ways.
It's incredible. But then you have someone like Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's first prime minister. Totally different perspective on Vietnam's role in all of this. He flicks the script entirely.
Yeah, he really does.
Yeah.
You've probably never thought about it this way, but Lee Kuan Yew argued that the U.S. presence in Vietnam, even with all its flaws, actually bought valuable time for other Southeast Asian nations to get ready to defend themselves against communism. It's a perspective you don't hear that often.
So while Vietnam itself tragically fell, it gave countries like Thailand, Malaysia, even Singapore, the breathing room they needed to avoid falling under communist influence.
That's the argument. It inadvertently created this buffer zone. Historian Jim Rower, he makes a similar case in his book, Asia Rising. He says that even though the U.S. couldn't save South Vietnam, being involved, however messy it was, gave those other countries a chance to build up their economies, resist that communist pressure. They stabilized, avoided Vietnam's fate. It's a compelling argument. It's almost like Vietnam accidentally messed up the communist plans, gave those other countries a chance to, get their act together.
It makes you wonder, did the U.S., just by showing up, even though they didn't get a clear win, did that have a ripple effect? Were other countries watching that and thinking, uh-oh, maybe we don't want to mess with these guys, they're not afraid to fight?
That's the big question, isn't it? And the historian John Lewis Gaddis, he's really explored that idea. He argues that, Vietnam was a tactical loss for the U.S., but it sent a message to the Soviets, hey, we're serious about this containment thing. We'll commit resources, manpower, whatever it takes.
Even if it means heavy losses.
Exactly. So even in defeat, there's this message, right? We're not backing down. And Gaddis argues that actually had a real impact on how the Soviets approached things elsewhere.
Yeah.
They couldn't just assume the U.S. would back down easily, even if the initial fight got messy.
Wow. Unintended consequences. It really gets you thinking about how an event like that, it just changes the whole game, even years later.
For sure. And those ripples, they went both ways. Vietnam forced a major rethink for the U.S. military, too. How do we approach these situations? It really highlighted the limitations of just sending in troops all the time, which led to...
the Nixon Doctrine.
Exactly.
Which, if I'm remembering right, was all about the U.S. relying more on allies, sharing the burden, instead of always being the main fighting force.
You got it. The Nixon Doctrine was all about supporting and equipping allies to fight communism, but not necessarily, doing all the heavy lifting themselves. Direct result of those hard lessons from Vietnam.
And it wasn't just about shifting the approach with existing allies either, right?
Yeah.
Didn't Vietnam also lead to some really key partnerships becoming even stronger?
Absolutely. Look at the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, for example. That became even more crucial after Vietnam. Japan emerged as this, essential ally in containing communism in Asia, both economically and militarily.
Which is interesting because going back to that domino theory we were talking about earlier, it didn't really happen the way people thought it would, at least not in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, that's important. Laos and Cambodia, they did end up with communist regimes, but the dominoes stopped there. Countries like Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, they went their own way, developed strong economies, resisted those communist movements.
So the domino theory, this very simplistic view of how things would play out, it turned out to be, well, wrong.
It shows how dangerous it is to approach foreign policy with this one-size-fits-all mentality, especially without really understanding what's going on in each individual country. Like in Vietnam, for example, you have to remember how important nationalism was, the desire for independence. That was huge for figures like Ho Chi Minh.
So it wasn't just about communism for him.
Yeah. Right, communism was part of his ideology, for sure. But it's not the whole story. When you boil these complex situations down to these simple either things, you miss so much of the nuance.
It's like trying to, cram for a history test by just memorizing dates without understanding the context, You might pass the test, but you're not really learning anything.
Exactly. And that's what makes studying history so interesting, There's always more to uncover, more perspectives to consider.
So this whole idea of containing communism just through a military lens, without really getting the local context, the people caught in the middle, it was always going to be problematic, wasn't it?
You got it. We have to remember, these weren't just abstract pieces on a chessboard. These were real countries with histories, cultures, their own internal struggles. And all of that fed into how they responded to the pressures of the Cold War.
It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? But,
yeah.
Okay, zooming out a bit. When we look at this whole idea of containment throughout the Cold War, how do we even judge if it worked or not? It's not like there's a clear winner or loser, right?
Yeah, it's definitely not that simple. If we look at Europe, for instance, by the late 70s, you could argue containment was going pretty well. NATO was this strong force against Soviet expansion, and then the Marshall Plan, that helped rebuild Western Europe, turned it into this economic powerhouse.
So in Europe, kind of a success story, or at least on the surface.
Well, there's always more to it, right? I mean, the human cost of the Cold War, a divided Europe, that constant fear of nuclear annihilation, those are some heavy prices to pay. But if the goal was preventing a larger war, stopping the Soviets from expanding in Europe, yeah, you could say containment achieved that.
And what about other parts of the world? We've talked a lot about Southeast Asia, but what about places like Korea, Japan, Taiwan? How did containment play out in those areas?
Asia, that's where things get a bit more complicated. The Korean War, for example, that was a stalemate, but it did stop the communist North from taking over the South. And like we were saying earlier, that U.S.-Japan alliance, the support for South Korea and Taiwan, all of that was super important in stopping the spread of communism there.
So, kind of a mixed bag in Asia. Not a total failure for containment, but definitely more complicated than Europe.
Exactly. And that brings us back to Vietnam, right? It's so tough to give a straight answer about whether it was a complete disaster for containment or not.
It really is. Because you have this undeniable human cost. The loss of life, all the political turmoil, the disillusionment it caused. It's impossible to ignore that.
Absolutely. But then on the other side, you have this argument that U.S. involvement, even if it was flawed, might have actually kept communism from spreading even further in Southeast Asia. It changed U.S. foreign policy in a major way, right? Moving away from direct military action and towards relying more on allies. And it made people realize that you can't just have this one-size-fits-all approach to these super complicated situations.
It's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube.
Right.
Every move you make has all these different consequences. Some you expect, some you don't. So how do we even begin to reconcile these two seemingly opposite sides of the Vietnam War? What's the takeaway for someone listening to all of this?
I think that's the beauty of history, isn't it? It's not about easy answers or clear victories. It's about grappling with these gray areas, understanding that even when people have good intentions, things can still go wrong, sometimes tragically wrong.
You've given us a lot to think about, that's for sure. And for everyone listening, I think the big takeaway here is that history is never black and white. It's messy, it's complex, and it's full of surprises. It's about really digging into that complexity, questioning what you think you know, and remembering that there are always multiple sides to every story.
Well said. And if the Vietnam War teaches us anything, it's that the most important questions are often the toughest ones to answer.
Couldn't agree more. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those questions. This has been The Deep Dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep diving deep into the stories that have shaped our world.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.